A very warm good afternoon to all of you. I'm Sakshi, welcoming you all on behalf of Solar Quarter and First View Group to Top 5 Solar Developments in Southern Africa. I take the pleasure to thank our panel members for extending their immense support to organize this event, and a very special thanks to our partner Trina Solar. I would now request my team to play the promotional video. Thank you, team, for playing that. May I now introduce Mr. Zahir Khan, Regional Director, South Africa, Trina Sola, to give the presentation for his company. Over to you, Mr. Khan.
Hi, good afternoon, and thanks actually for that introduction, and welcome to everybody that's on the webinar forum. We really appreciate the opportunity to present to you today. There's some discussion questions coming up soon, but I think for now, let me begin with our presentation. Sakshi, can you confirm that you can see the screen adequately?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay. So I think that the first point to talk about, which talks to the subject of module reliability, I think you can't talk about the topic of module reliability without considering the reliability of the supplier that's providing those modules. So I think one feather under our cap is, I believe, we're the only manufacturer who has been in existence for longer than its warranty period. So many companies offer 25-year warranties, but I think we're the only one that has actually been around for more than 25 years and can therefore back that up. So just a little bit about our history. Founded in 1997, listed on the New York Stock Exchange in 2006. In 2020, we also listed on the Shanghai Stock Exchange. And as of last year, we've shipped more than 120 gigawatts of panels globally. We've got various offices all around the world and over 23,000 employees. And, you know, it's all very well for me to say we're a great company, but usually it's better to have a third-party opinion. And Bloomberg New Energy Finance, I'm sure everybody knows Bloomberg. Bloomberg has rated Trina Solar as 100% bankable for the past 7 years in a row. Furthermore, PV Tech, another independent company, has ranked us AAA in terms of bankability. And PV Evolution Labs were more of a technical assessment center. They've given us, for the past 8 years, a ranking of top performer according to their PV module reliability scorecard. And as I mentioned, we've been in existence for just over 25 years. This year is our 26th year in existence. And over that period, we've had more than 25 world records for cell efficiency and module efficiency. We've also applied for more than 2,200 patents. So I think we can reasonably claim to be at the forefront of research and development in the PV field. Okay, that's just by way of introduction to the company. As far as the products are concerned, we've got quite a wide range of products, many of them based on the current generation of P-type cells. And the big news this year is the introduction of N-type cells. I'll tell you a bit more about the advantage of N-type versus the current P-type shortly. But for today's presentation, if there's any takeaways, there's basically 2 points I'd like the audience to remember. The one is about the new rectangular cells, and the second is about the advantages of N-type panels. In terms of technology, I think the introductory video just quickly covered some of the topics, but in terms of wafer size, going back to when I joined the PV industry about 10 years ago, the 156 and 158 millimeter cells were the common size. For those who've been in the industry for 10 plus years, a decade ago, almost all panels were 250 watt panels. Nowadays, there's a plethora of different sizes and outputs and voltages, and it's difficult to navigate yourself through it. But several years after that, the 166 millimeter cell became popular. And then over the past 3 years or so, essentially two camps developed. There was a camp that promoted the 182 millimeter wafer size, and there was another group that promoted the 210 millimeter wafer size. Trina Solar decided to basically leapfrog all the way to the 210 millimeter size, which has several advantages. One of the main being that you get a fairly high current from a 210 millimeter cell. Essentially, the amount of current you get from a cell or from a module is proportional to the area of the cell. So by going to 210 millimeter, we are able to produce panels with power outputs exceeding 650 watts. In fact, in our latest generation of the N-type version, we're close to 700 megawatts, 700 watts, not megawatts, 700 watts from a single solar panel. We've also employed various other technologies which are difficult to see, but under the skin, for our cutting process, we use a non-destructive laser cutting process, which reduces the risk of microcracking. We also have a high density encapsulation method. So essentially what that means is previously the spacing between cells used to be 2 millimeters. By using different ribbons, we are now able to reduce the cell spacing to approximately 0.5 millimeter between cells. And multi-bus bar has become a new standard in the industry, which we've also adopted. So just to talk about those 2 points, I would like you to remember. The first being rectangular cells. So we mentioned 182 millimeter cells as being deployed by one camp within the solar industry. And Trina Solar, for the past 2 to 3 years, has been promoting the 210 millimeter cells. However, as of this year, we now have a new format, which is a rectangular format. So on one side of the rectangle, it's 210 millimeters, and the other dimension is 182 millimeters. So the big deal about this to remember is, especially for your commercial and industrial segments, where the string inverters in the current generation from many of the mainstream inverter manufacturers such as Sungrow, Huawei, Solus, Goodwe, etc. All those manufacturers of inverters nowadays have inverters that can handle 30 amps per MPPT. So by reducing our cell size from 210 to a rectangular 210 by 182, the output of the cell and the module is now about 14.8 amps. So that allows you to put 2 strings per MPPT on your inverter, and you would get about 29.6 amps coming out of those 2 strings. So that 29.6 amps is virtually a perfect match for the current generation of inverters. So you're able to basically minimize your LCOE and get the biggest bang for your buck with this new format. And then the N-type cells, I think the key points to remember about the new N-type materials that are being used in solar panels these days is, firstly, the efficiency has increased. So basically, with a P-type panel of the same dimensions, the same physical dimensions, previously you were getting about 660 watts. Now with the N-type version, you're getting an extra 20 watts. So let's call it 685, 690 watts, and sometimes 695 watt panels from the same physical dimensions. So obviously, being able to get more power from the same area will save you on your balance of system costs. The other point to remember is that with N-type panels, you get a much better degradation rate. So compared to P-type panels, where the first year degradation was approximately 2% per annum, with N-type panels, the first year degradation is only 1% per annum. Well, 1% in the first year, I should say. In the subsequent years, with P-type panels, you used to get 0.55% per annum degradation. However, with N-type, it's only 0.4% per annum degradation. So that's the second advantage. The third advantage is related to the temperature handling capability of N-type panels. So the more technical amongst you will be familiar with the fact that when panels get hotter, the voltage of the panels drops. So typically you lose about 10% of your power just due to the temperature of the panel. However, with the new N-type panels, the temperature coefficient has improved by about 12%. So that 12% of the 10% means you get 1% more yield due to temperature, the improved temperature handling. The fourth point is not particularly relevant for your rooftop segment, but for those doing trackers or ground-mounted systems, the previous P-type panels had a bifaciality factor of approximately 70%, whereas the new N-type panels have a bifaciality of 80% or more. So just to give you a quick overview of the panels we have for the various segments within the solar industry. On the left-hand side, you see the panels we are marketing for the residential segment. So the one on the furthest left is our current generation of Vertex S panels, which have power outputs up to 435 watts. The reason we're marketing that more towards residential is that the output, the current output, is approximately 10 to 11 amps per panel, which matches very well with your residential type inverters, particularly your hybrid residential inverters, where the MPPTs usually can't take more than about 12 to 12 and a half amps. So that same Vertex S panel in the P-type version, when you look at the new N-type version, which we already have in production, you get about 20 watts more per panel from the N-type version. And all those 4 points I mentioned when I spoke to the last slide about the better bifaciality, the better degradation, the better thermal performance, and the higher efficiency. Then moving towards the middle of the screen, the current rectangular cell that we have on the DEG19RCs and the DE19Rs, those panels have an output of 570 and 575 watts. whereas the new N-type version of that will have power outputs of approximately 600 watts. Then moving to the right-hand side of the screen, uh, those panels, the DEG21C and the NEG21C, are your larger format panels, which are geared more towards your utility scale plants or solar farms, where the P-type versions were about 670 watts and the N-type versions are 695 watts. Yeah, so I think based on the time slots that I had available, I think I've covered the main points I would like to have discussed today. If you'd like to get into contact with us, there's some email addresses on the screen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Khan, for that insightful presentation. Um, if you could just stop sharing your screen. All right, great. So, thank you once again. Here, I would like to make a small announcement. Attendees can post their questions in the Q&A chat box, and our speakers will take up those at the end of the panel discussion. As we all are aware that Southern Africa has all the potential to become a powerful solar hub thanks to its geographical suitability. The region receives more daylight as per year as compared to any other continent, which makes PV panels to be a feasible replacement for fossil fuels. The region is also accelerating the use of renewable power generation as increasing urbanization, population growth, and economic development are surging power demand. So now, without any further ado, let us initiate our much awaited panel discussion session for today. Allow me to introduce the proficient panel today. Mr. Samir, who's the carbon markets national expert, Mr. Khan, a regional director, South Africa from Trina Solar, Mr. Nathan from Chemical Engineering, Mr. Gabriel Cross from Empower, Mr. Tawanda from Regain 37 Private Limited. Mr. Samir will be the moderator for the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Shaksi, for this fantastic
Sir, I think you're on mute.
sorry about that. Big thanks to Shaksi for first of all, and all the Solar Quarter staff behind the scenes. They are doing fantastic job in supporting us and making everything going smoothly. And huge thanks to our supporter and platinum partner Trina Solar. And the presentation was really informative, and we are looking forward for to using the Trina solar modules all over the world. Uh, we start with Mr. Zahir and a brief introduction about Mr. Zahir. He is the regional director for South Africa, and in his early career, he worked as an engineer in the controls systems and software development fields. Later, at ESCOM, he was appointed as head of integrated strategic electricity planning, responsible for new capacity investment planning and optimization, as well as its demand side management and energy efficiency programs. Inspired by the prospects of the solar photovoltaic industry, he led himself to start up a company focused on clean energy consulting, engineering design, and the development of solar PV projects. And currently, he's leading a team of professionals uh, at Trina Solar, of course. We were discussing together before the event about the development of the solar industry during the 70s, since the 1970s until recently, 2022. The overall installations of solar PV around the world are close to 1 terawatts. And this year, it is the IEA and other big agencies, energy agencies around the world, are expecting that the solar PV installation will be around 300 gigawatts. So What this means is that in the next 3 years, we will have around 1 terawatt. So, what took the world 40 years to accomplish, we will accomplish it in the future, in the very near future, within 3 years. So, this is really a huge and significant development for clean energy, and very good news to everybody that is working in the PV industry. So a lot of solar is going to happen in the next few years. Mr. Zahir, we have 10 minutes for each speaker. So I'd like to ask you a couple of questions, and if you can take like 5 minutes answering each of them. First question is about the significance of the recent liberalization of South Africa's power sector by changing the licensing threshold for private solar investment in the region. What are your opinions on this issue? Over to you, Mr. Zahir.
Thank you. Yes. So it's been good news for some and not so good news for others. So if I think about the Renewable Energy IPP program, which has been ongoing for the past decade in South Africa, I'm sure many of the members of the audience are familiar with the program, but it's essentially the government-run procurement program, and it has specific requirements in terms of local content and empowerment, and obviously price and other factors. However, if we look at what happened in round 6 of the REIPP program, which was the winners were just announced in December last year. Of all the wind power projects, I think there was something like 46 wind power projects that were bid into the REIPP 6. Of those 46, a total of 0 were actually awarded preferred bidders. The main reason being that the transmission capacity within the sort of coastal and ideal wind zones of the country had already been utilized by private power plants developers that had already applied for that capacity in the intervening period. So not so good news for some players in the REIPP program, but certainly good news for private players and South Africa as a whole, of course. So we see a burgeoning development within the private utility size space, which is more run on commercial lines, which is good news for us because they don't have particular local content requirements and so on. Also, their pace of execution is a lot faster than the REIP program has proven to be. So in that sense, the lifting of the cap has been good news for especially large electricity consumers. The majority of them being your mining companies and other large industrial players. So a few of them have actually been kicked off already. So last year was one of the first publicly announced successful private plants, that being the 2 Tronox plants of a total of 260 megawatts that was already basically been awarded and is now going through its procurement and commissioning phases. Well, not quite commissioning yet, but they've already kicked off construction on those plants. And we see quite a big pipeline of further private power plants. Of course, lifting the cap on licensing and registration isn't the only factor that would enable bigger uptake in that sector. I mean, it's sort of a moving bottleneck. So whereas the cap for private generation has been lifted, the industry still faces a few other bottlenecks. The one I mentioned in particular was the transmission capacity constraint. So we're still fairly reliant on the national utility ESCOM on ensuring that there's sufficient development to remove the bottlenecks that might exist in the transmission sector specifically to enable a faster rollout of these big private power plants.
Interesting, very interesting. This is very good news for the industry and for the solar, but
Mm.
which also means that South Africa needs to do major infrastructure development in order to uptake more renewable energies in the future. Um, my second question is about how a robust solar rooftop uptake can meaningfully contribute to stabilizing the region's crippling power sector and the way forward. Can you elaborate on that, Mr. Zahir? Over to you.
Yes, it actually relates to the first question as well, that being the transmission bottleneck issue. So, in contrast, the rooftop segment is widely distributed over the country, and therefore doesn't face the same transmission capacity bottlenecks that the large solar farms do. So we see that as at least a short to medium term way of expanding solar rollouts throughout the country. And South Africa generally, Southern Africa, in fact, generally, has very high solar irradiation levels and reasonably uniformly distributed around the country. So if you look at the average solar irradiation in South Africa, which is over 2,000 kilowatt hours per square meter per annum, it's roughly double the average in Europe. So, and if you look at, even let's call it the areas of the country that don't have very high irradiation, by comparison with our European counterparts, even the worst parts of South Africa have an equivalent amount of irradiation that's similar to countries like Germany, which are at about 1,400 watt hours per square meter. Um, so I think the prospects for economically viable rooftop solar generation are really good. There are still quite a few constraints in that segment. And I think many players within the South African industry would agree that if distributors and government and ESCOM come to the party, they would they need to actually create a suitable policy environment to enable a greater uptake of rooftop in South Africa. For example, at the moment, residential users that are connected to the ESCOM low voltage grid aren't able to feed electricity back into the grid legally. So some of those constraints need to be removed in order to be able to utilize some of that capacity. In fact, many rooftop users now are compelled to limit or prevent export of electricity into the grid, in order to comply with legislation, which is somewhat counterproductive. That you have users who have excess supply, which could help alleviate the load shedding issues we're having in the country, but are prevented from doing so due to policy and constraints from the distributors. However, having said that, certain municipalities and metropolitan areas within the country are beginning to relax some of those constraints. I think we can all agree that Cape Town is something of a leader in that segment, and have created a suitable environment to allow users to be able to feed their excess power into the grid. Over the past few months, the mayor of Cape Town has announced a program which allows, I think in the first phase, it's more targeted at business users, and in subsequent phases towards residential users, whereby they'd be able to get cash payments for the excess electricity they inject into the grid. So there's positive news there, but I think a lot more can be done, because if you look at the amount of rooftop solar generated in South Africa, and you benchmark it against countries such as Australia, you can see we could easily increase our rooftop solar power generation tenfold without getting into any constraints from a technical perspective.
Yes, it's always interesting how the grid operator enforces their regulations. In each country, it's different. So I hope it works out for you in South Africa and you install much more solar. And definitely there is a need, and solar is getting cheaper by the day and more competitive. So businesses, they need to make sure that they have the cheapest energy to keep their economical engine moving. So solar is very interesting in the future for commercial and industrial and everybody. Thank you very much, Mr. Jahir. I'm sure that we will get back to you in the open questions from our attendees. And thank you very much. Our next
Pleasure.
speaker is Mr. Gabriel. How are you, Mr. Gabriel?
I'm doing well, guys. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Mr. Gabriel is the head of engineering at Empower Company, and maybe you can give us like a few lines about yourself and the company, and then we can start asking you questions. Over to you, Gabriel.
Thanks, Samir and Zahir. And yeah, so of course, for arranging this. So, Empower is an EPC in the solar and battery space. Our typical projects range from a couple of 100 kilowatt to, up to about 5 or 10 megawatt. Those are the sort of biggest projects we're doing at the moment. And on the battery side, our biggest project to date would be 2.5 MVA, 6 megawatt hours of storage. And yeah, maybe even before we go into the questions, I want to comment on one of Zahir's statements, and was related to the grid capacity, being sort of taken up, all the transmission constraints. And um, you know, if you asked me, 5 years ago, I probably would have said that Africa as a continent in general doesn't have a generation issue or a generation shortage, but rather a transmission and distribution shortage. If we can just somehow get all the generation plants to link up to the right off takers, then you could solve a number of these problems. But talking about South Africa specifically, when Eskom or our power grid access unit tells us that they don't have grid capacity available, what they're actually saying is that during some time of the day they may not have grid capacity available. It's only when generation is at its maximum when that constraint is active. And that basically leaves a big door open for batteries, or dispatchable energy, that can utilize the same grid, at other times that these generation units aren't operating at full capacity. So, and this is something that I wanted to throw back to Eskom, is to say that, yes, I appreciate the fact that in the Northern Cape, and then for solar, and in some of the coastal areas where the wind is good, you might have grid constraints during peak generation, but you can use that same grid, during times of low generation, to dispatch batteries, or to uptake and potentially absorb some of this excess generation, and to dispatch that at later points in time. And this is some of the studies that we've done for Eskom to show where in the grid they can install batteries to enable a larger amount of renewable penetration, given the current constraints of maximum generation within the grid at the moment. So yeah, but I think with that I'll pass it back to you, Samir, if there's some of the questions that you want to, unless Zahir wants to quickly comment on that before we go into my questions.
Yes, what you're doing is actually very admirable and intelligent, and definitely technical issues might be you might solve the technical issues, but also you have contractual issues that have financial commitment.
Implications, yeah.
So it's the grid operator always have their hands full and too many balls to juggle at the same time. So yes, but definitely the storage, all kinds of storage will add the flexibility, and the grid operator on the transmission level and the distribution level should have a percentage of storage. So I'm sure that you'll have plenty of work in the future, and you'll keep supplying and these lithium-ion batteries and different kind of storage as well. Going back to our questions, we have the first question is about how does the commercial and industrial and residential market benefit or change due to increased uptake of utility scale renewable energy power. Can you elaborate on that? Over to you,
Um,
Gabriel.
Thanks. Yeah. So I think one of the things that is critical for us to understand is that With the big solar plants coming into South Africa, the other markets are benefiting, as a spin-off. Talking about China, if they're bringing 150 megawatts worth of panels in, it means that they're opening distribution channels, they're setting up, factories, local sort of warehouses, and the spin-off is that the CNI markets and residential markets can benefit off the back of that. So we can tap into those distribution channels and the availability of the panels because of China, and other players, both on the solar panel and inverter manufacturer, because of their existing footprints in the market, and it does allow for cheaper and quicker installations in both the commercial, industrial, and residential markets. And in order for us as a country to combat load shedding and power outages, we need to attack this on all levels. Both on a utility scale level, getting sort of big utility scale plants off the ground, but also on residential and commercial and industrial levels. And it's good to appreciate that a whole bunch of the smaller ones, installing a number of residential or commercial and industrial projects, can alleviate or reduce the constraints on the grid, the same as one big plant, can do. And I think, as in, back to my initial comment saying that, that Africa as a continent has a bigger transmission and distribution issue or problem rather than a generation issue. If you do the generation at the source, that completely removes, the challenge of transmission and distribution. Because even if we do build, several big utility scale power plants, if the grid is down, you can't get that power, to your, end user. Whereas if you have cogeneration on site, whether it's residential or commercial, then that power is right there, and it's not dependent on the grid's availability for you to have access to that power, and that is the case both for solar and batteries. I think it's also useful to note, and we've spent hours in conversation with different off-takers on this, to sensitize people to what solar can and can't do on its own, and where you need batteries or integration of solar with generators. Because I can't tell you how many times I get phone calls saying that, hey, I'm sick of load shedding. Can I, please come and install solar at my factory? And then you have to go through the process of explaining to them, well, actually, solar isn't going to solve your load shedding problem, unless you have something grid forming, whether that's batteries or generator. Then the solar isn't going to help you at all. So, yeah.
Yeah, a very good answer. I think the development at this stage, the market and the grid will allow the uptake of a huge amount of commercial and industrial and solar at this stage. But because the market and the grid is big in South Africa, so you have plenty of potential for the next few years. And our second question is this: what is the impact of batteries on solar and vice versa, in the context of market uptake? Can you elaborate on that? Over to
So
you. Yeah.
I think I've touched on some of that already, but it's key to understand that solar and batteries solve two different problems. So solar on its own, cannot provide a sustainable solution for backup power, and it's key for us to appreciate the fact that solar isn't ever gonna solve that problem. And batteries, on the other hand, though they can provide you with the backup power that you need, on their own, they don't have any generation capacity. So if you have extended outages, batteries will end up with limitations of how long they can run. And to that end, the battery industry does need solar, especially if you're operating off grid or if you're operating for extended time, without backup power, in order to generate that electricity to provide you with that source of power that can charge the batteries. So the solar industry will definitely benefit, from batteries entering in the market, because the combination of the two can provide backup power, and similarly the battery industry will benefit from the solar market, because if the solar market was to increase, there's always this question of what happens to my solar power during power outages, and why come I can't use this solar during load shedding periods. And the answer is that if you have a battery backup system that can do grid forming, then you can use your solar in parallel with your batteries to run your plants for extended periods of time. And in that way, these two technologies enable each other, and increased in battery uptake will definitely result in more solar, and the similar in the other way around, where the bigger rollouts we see in solar projects across South Africa, the bigger the demand for batteries will be to add onto those. Sometimes retrofitted, and after the fact, but sometimes even from the start, the guys will say, I want this to be able to operate, during load shedding, during extended periods of time, whether you have vandalism or failures of transformers, because that's something else that we don't speak about often enough. But let me finish my one sentence. So these two will definitely work hand in hand and increase each other. But something else that I've noticed is that outages, or regular outages, or load shedding in South Africa, has a massive negative impact, on electrical infrastructure. We're seeing transformers, going through a lot of switching, and they simply weren't made for that. We're seeing motorized breakers, typical isolation breakers for our PV plants used to be spec'd at 3,000 cycles. Now, if you've got 3 load shedding events in a day, they're switching 6 times a day. That means you're reaching that cycle life, within a couple of years. Now, we can't, as an EPC, go out and replace, breakers every 2 or 3 years, for all the PV plants that we've installed. So there's also a pressure on the industry, that the hardware suppliers to come up with solutions to that, to say, do we need to build breakers that can do 30 or 60,000 cycles, or do we need to oversize it, or how do we as an industry, from a technology perspective, deal with the demand that load shedding puts on the electrical infrastructure that we need to deal with? And that's over and above the batteries and the solar side that provides us with that backup. Obviously, the batteries and the solar alleviates that to some extent. If they are in play, it means that you don't have the same amount of switching. But if you still need to switch, or you still need to isolate your system from the grid to prevent feeding power back into Eskom, then you're still going to have those number of cycles. And it's something that wasn't planned for. That if you talk to an ABB or a Schneider 5 years ago, they said that they never foresee us needing to do so many cycles in a year, where nowadays it's commonplace for those breakers to go through that number of cycles. And the industry as a general need to find a solution to that.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for your insights. Very good information from highly respected professional like you. Thank you very much, Gabriel.
It's a pleasure.
Nathan, are you with us?
Always, Samir.
Excellent. And Nathan has been involved in the solar PV on the mounting structure side since 2011. To date, he has been involved in approximately 600 megawatt peak, from the large scale utility to the industrial commercial projects ranging from 50 kW to 90 megawatts. The projects that he has been involved have canvassed the African continent and presented new and exciting challenges that at times have been difficult to overcome, but allowed for unique learning opportunities. He established a German subsidiary company in South Africa to take advantage of the REIPP program in 2015. He established Caracal Engineering, and the Caracal, we had a very good discussion before the meeting, and hopefully we will see you soon in Jordan and visit our Caracal. and everybody is invited, of course. We'd like to start out with the question about how South African renewable energy independent power producer procurement program accelerated the installation and uptake of cheaper solar power in the country. Can you elaborate on that, Nathan? Over to you.
Yeah, of course. I think the RIPP program was excellent at catalyzing an entirely new sector, both in wind and in PV. I think the way in which it was run was obviously sort of very clear to the market. It attracted a hell of a lot of interest in a new market, sort of far away from the home markets that were susceptible to sort of fluctuating feed-in tariffs. I know in Europe at the time there was sort of like a set amount, that the utility or the government were prepared to pay European suppliers of renewable energy. But that was reset sort of at the beginning of every year. So there used to be an absolute clamor towards the end of the year to get plants built. Whereas, South Africa went with a slightly different approach with a bidding process. Obviously, the country wasn't really sure on what the bid price, or sorry, what the feed-in tariff should be. So rather left it up to the market to determine what that number is. So the benefit of that, obviously, is this rapid declination of pricing as competition ramps up for a finite amount of capacity available. So, of course, that then sort of pressures the market into identifying areas where they can optimize efficiencies and bring down costs so that it makes their bid a lot more attractive to the off-taker in Eskom, and obviously sovereign backed by the South African state. So it certainly was a very interesting program on the front end, one that was very transparent as well. Sort of never really came under any sort of criticism from any of the bidders, and if it was murmuring, so nothing sort of pronounced. So because of that transparency and the bid review process, and it built a lot of trust in sort of a renewable energy market in the country. The motivation for initiating it, of course, was as a result of Madupa and Kasila's funding requirements and sort of a cascading implication that South Africa would need to roll out a certain amount of renewables in order to access all that funding. So, all in all, I think it's been a very good program, sort of rounds 1, 2, and 3. The great sort of tragedy of the whole IPP process is it's hobbling through the rounds and creating a very uncertain marketplace. You can imagine if you're a large supplier like some of the inverter suppliers, that it's set up infrastructure in the country to manufacture locally to supply to these projects. You can't sustain an organization when there's a 2-year gap between rounds 3 and 4 and 4.5 or 5. Even the naming convention got slightly skewed. So while it was excellent on the front end, it also developed a hell of a lot of local skill that could execute projects on scale very quickly, because of the sort of the lapse or the gap between these rounds was extended sort of unnecessarily so by sort of political meddling. We sort of lost the momentum. While the beneficiaries sort of further down, sort of the commercial industrial sector and I suppose to an extent the residential, would have benefited from the upskilling of a lot of local people capable of executing the work, which is a handy offspin of this thing. I suppose another one would have been, suppliers looking to penetrate those markets further down in terms of capacities and decision making, etc. They obviously would have benefited, or the consumers would have benefited from that because, Trina, Canadian, JA, Jinko, etc., and all the other large inverter manufacturers, etc., would have had product in the market, or at least, like Gabriel mentioned, an open supply chain, right, that they could disseminate their product through. The problem is that you can't sustain this indefinitely and have all the resources on the ground. Feet on the ground cost money, and the market simply, wasn't large enough to accommodate it. And we're seeing now as well with round 6 that there's of course a big appetite for bidding on these projects. Sort of away from the away from the capacity constraints on the grid. um, there's obviously still an interest. It's sovereign backed, and of course, I think the external to South Africa still reckons that the South African sovereign balance sheet is worth something, so it's worth taking a punt. And those prices have come down significantly. I think the first projects I worked on, I think they were bid at £2.65. I don't even know what bid round six came in at, but I imagine it would have been around about 60, 70 cents. So the market as a whole has benefited. I mean, it's been an interesting sort of scenario for sub suppliers in the space because because of the democratization of energy provision by solar PV and wind, and sort of this very open access to information in terms of the costs per kilowatt hour. I mean, you can Google it and you can find it fairly quickly. It does put a hell of a lot of pressure further down the value chain because obviously at an IPP level, 90 megawatts, you get a certain price, and then at a 1 megawatt, the expectation is the price is almost the same, which obviously is not the case because the scale isn't there. But this is generally how it translates. So I think from a catalyzation perspective, certainly from an interest and a funding perspective, and sort of being on the leading edge, I think the rest of the market has been the beneficiary on the bleeding edge. Obviously, seeing these things work or not work, and sort of learning vicariously through other companies. I think on the whole, it was excellent at the front, and it lost its way.
Very good insights from highly respected professional like you, Nathan. Thank you very much.
No problem.
It's yes, it's always interesting, and I think the solar market is developing, let's say, very fast. And the PV modules, of course, because the companies are big and they have all this supply chain, they can develop their products much more faster than the other components. We're seeing, let's say, development in the PV modules, but we're not seeing the same strength in the storage, for example. So the storage industry just started. So I think at one stage we'll have, once we have a comprehensive development moving at the same scale, same speed, it will be much. We'll have a much stronger market. Yes, go ahead, Gabriel.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. So historically, the uptake for solar, has been a lot quicker and easier. And somebody commented last week that they think that storage, energy storage or batteries is today where solar was 10 years ago. Where people need to be educated, you need to try and promote that, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I agreed to that sentiment. But then, if I look at the numbers, as Empower, our revenue, for batteries this year exceeds our revenue for solar. So we're doing basically more solar projects, or the solar takes up a bigger scope within the company than, or the batteries, just is bigger than the solar. So now, I mean, it's true. We need to also, take that within the circumstances that South Africa has a ton of load shedding, and it may just be a short period of time, a bit of a bubble that we are operating in. But it does also, give some insight into the fact that there was definitely a faster ramp up or faster acceptance of batteries as a technology, than the acceptance of solar, and I don't know why that is, but I'm happy that is the case. But yeah, so I think batteries is definitely a lot closer or here already in terms of the mind of the industry, and not just something that is a future technology that we will see come into play. It's already bigger than the solar game, for us at least.
Well, the solar storage, I would say, started aggressively last year in 2022, when the big PV suppliers started also offering the storage. So the storage is a tool, and it is in the market. It is penetrating where at different rates, at different markets. Definitely, we're very happy that you are reporting you have a lot of solar storage more than installing the systems, which is very good news. But overall, all around the world, the solar storage just picking up. But I'm sure that it will, at one stage, will have penetration all around the world at a much faster rate. We want to go back to Nathan and ask you one more question because we want to utilize your in-depth experience. What is the significance of the recent liberalization of South African power sector by changing the licensing threshold for private solar investment in the region? Over to you, Nathan.
So I think, I mean, I'd be reiterating quite a lot of what Zahir said in terms of the opening up of the sector. Certainly from a generation perspective, and then rehashing what Gabriel was saying on the T&D part. I think what my commentary will be on is more from a macro perspective. I think the liberalization isn't aggressive enough. South Africa has a significant energy crisis, and we are moving at a snail's pace to reduce regulations, either reduce them, eliminate them entirely, or get out the way. And I think I speak for the sector to a large extent in this way, that the state's interference in just about everything when it comes to infrastructure development is problematic. And I think the liberalization is a nice sort of forward step, but while superficially it looks like it's a relatively easy process to follow, the devil is in the detail. So going through the application process is as cumbersome, and trying to get grid access is as cumbersome, and to run the possibility of wheeling arrangements across the country is not clear. It's clear to some and unclear to others, and it depends on who you're speaking to within Eskom, etc. So I think, if South Africa was really serious about resolving its energy crisis, it would be removing all the barriers, and the state would be working to do that. And the things like grid capacity limitations, right, can be resolved because the state has got, the private sector has a profit motive to resolve this, and it'll do so quickly. The state moves at a snail's pace, or glacial in some cases, because there's no motivation to get this resolved. There simply isn't enough pressure. So the liberalization efforts, I think, from where we were 10 years ago to now, of course, are better. But I just don't feel like they're aggressive enough. We pay lip service as the private sector to the state, who when you sort of a conspiracy theorist, not like myself, but when you hear of these big power ships being brought into port in Cape Town and various other coastal cities to pump power into the grid on a 20-year PPA, you start to question whether this liberalization effort is purely to placate momentarily the private sector. So I think on the one hand, it's good, and it's a forward step in the fact that we can gain a greater amount of generation capacity. I feel that it's just not significant enough. If you have a look at Vietnam's efforts when they were going through an energy crisis, heavy subsidies into their rooftop solar side, trying to get power online. And I think this is often where there's a breakdown, certainly from our state, is that the cheaper the primary inputs, the cheaper the manufacturing cost to make a secondary, tertiary, or quaternary product, right? So it's not the kilowatt hour in itself is not interesting. It's what you produce from it. But we have such an obscure fixation on the kilowatt hour and not on what it produces. So we should be freeing up, not constraining that access to cheaper power, right? Which we can clearly do here. I mean, Gabriel and Zahir, and pretty much everybody here knows that PV as a generator is by far cheaper than anything we have available at the moment. I mean, Madupe and Kasila's numbers as an LCOE, I don't know, but at the moment, R1.10, R1.15. I mean, if you actually, that's on their nameplates. If you took what they actually produce, it's probably like R3, right? So this doesn't make sense to use as a primary source when you've got private sector funding. So it reduces the risk on the balance sheet of the states, and it's there to be deployed. So I feel quite passionately about this because I don't see a reciprocated effort from the state to resolve a problem where they simply need to move out the way. The private sector will resolve this problem, in my estimation, within the next 5 years, purely on its own back, despite or in spite of the regulations that stand in the way. So the liberalization, to answer your short question in an extremely long-winded and roundabout way, yes, it's good that this has started. It's just simply not good enough.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Yeah, I share a lot of experiences with you, and I think the solar PV and storage sectors are moving ahead very fast. At one point in time, the investor will have the option to just develop a microgrid or just get out of the grid, and because it will be cheaper unless the regulators find ways to solve their technical problems and commercial uh, agreements with the other generators. Thank you very much, Nathan, and I'm sure we will get back to you with more questions in the shortly. Our last speaker, Mr. Tawanda, are you with us?
Unfortunately, Mr. Tabanda is facing some connectivity issues.
Okay, okay. Would you like to take some questions from the audience, and maybe we can check with Mr. Tawanda later on? Or you would like me to ask more questions from my side?
Sure, so we could
I'm ha-
just create some questions in here and we can continue
Yes.
our conversation then.
Okay. For facilitating on the non-technical side of solar development, I would like to hear from our speakers if they have any experience in solar leasing, and to which limit this has been achieved in Africa. Hint Hadidi. Solar leasing. Nathan, would you like to answer this question?
Yeah, I mean, I can weigh in there to an extent. We've actually seen a proliferation of companies, concentrating on solar leasing or on PPA bases for commercial, industrial, and residential scale. So I think the relevant sort of success of it, is sort of just getting going. There's a number of companies in South Africa now, like I think it's Sun Exchange in South Africa, and there's a handful of others. And on the residential side, there's Go Solar and Versify, Solar EPC, and a handful more. So there's definitely a market for it. I think the limitation, obviously, with many consumers in constrained economies such as South Africa, is that you don't necessarily have the capex to undertake something that, let's say, it costs you 200,000 rand or 2 million rand. You don't have the cash available, or you want to allocate that resource to whatever you're producing. So that solar lease model and a PPA model has been taking off. I know that Gabriel in the EPC space probably has closer sight of it, but because we sort of canvass a number of EPCs and sort of project owners, we are seeing a lot more activity there. It addresses the affordability issues of a lot of consumers. And then I suppose de-risks those projects to a large extent, because the responsibility still rests with the fund that's funding it, or the EPC that's undertaking that. And where I see the real benefit to this is that everybody's kind of got an understanding of vehicles, right? You can see the difference between a Chana or a Sherry versus a Volvo or a Mercedes. It's quite easy. We're familiar with this, but it's very difficult to understand the difference between supplier A versus supplier B versus supplier C. So because there's a lot of market ignorance, guys tend to take on things that superficially look cheaper on the front end, end up costing them more in the long run. As one example. And the other one is just that there's not really a clear way of understanding how the project is sized. So, if you've got external capital coming in that you're paying off a lease arrangement, generally speaking, there should be a great amount of sort of technical investigation on the front end, because their money's at risk.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Shaksi, over to you. Do we have another question from the audience? Okay. What is the investment opportunity for foreign investor in Africa? Is there any specific policy for it? Will it be viable? Maybe Gabriel or Nathan. Gabriel,
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. I think from a
excellent.
policy perspective, there's definitely very different policies in each country. So that's very country specific, and the different countries have different ways of dealing with this. Also, there's a different weight or different value in sovereign backing or sovereign guarantees between different countries. We've seen, for example, recently Ghana. Going into a place where they forfeited, weren't able to pay their debt. So, there's a big question mark around whether sovereign guarantees, does provide, any sense of surety to an international investor. Something else to keep in mind also is something that we've seen or face challenges with is, foreign investment is often linked to foreign currency risk. So especially if you are looking to get into a PPA, power purchase agreement, or a lease agreement, if you're bringing in money in euros or dollars or pounds, often your investor would be expecting a return in euros or USD, which means that they would often try to peg the PPA tariffs against the exchange rate, which provides a massive amount of risk to the off-taker, because if their local currency, depreciates significantly, they would pay massively inflated tariffs in USD or euros, compared to their counterparts in local currency. On the other side, there's the risk could also sit with the investor to say that, if he gets a reduced return, in euros or USDs, because of the local currency depreciation, then you may have been better off to invest that money in a different country. One way to potentially get around this is to bring a large pool of money into a country, and then take a local view on it to say, I've brought my 100 million euros or USDs or whatever into Kenya or South Africa or wherever you're going, and then to say, okay, now I'm looking for a local return. I'm investing this into projects, I'm signing PPAs, and regardless of what the foreign currency exchange is, I'm making my return in the local currency. So there are ways to get around it, but the risk will always be there.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Very good answer. Shakshi, do we have another question?
No, I think we have come to the end of the session with this. Thank you so much,
Okay.
audience and the panelist. Would you like to give some closing remarks, Mr. Samir?
I'd like to ask one question, one final question to Mr. Zahir, because I want to understand exactly the type of panels that we have from Trina. Are all the sizes manufactured using the same cell efficiency?
Yes, so we've got, as I mentioned in my presentation, we've got different panels targeted at different segments. So
Mhm.
the current range of, let's call them P-type panels, where the main material in the cell is of a P-type nature. That one
Okay.
has a slightly lower efficiency than the new versions of N-type panels.
Mhm.
So, I mean, it comes at a small cost premium, but we think that overall, with all the other benefits, the better degradation, the better thermal performance, etc. Overall, when you look at your complete business case, and I know residential users don't often look at detailed business cases, but your commercial, industrial, and utility scale customers definitely do. And if you
Yeah.
look at a parameter such as LCOE, which is your levelized cost of electricity, we've done several case studies, and we've got a few reference projects as well, which show that you overall on your system with the N-type more efficient panels, you get about a 5% or better saving in your LCOE. So, I mean, a 5% saving is quite a big number when you're looking at utility scale and CNI projects. But yeah, the terrain is constantly moving. I think
Yeah.
if you look back at your 250 watt panels from 10 years ago, now we're looking at 700 watts plus. Uh, okay, bigger panels than the physically bigger panels, but still, I think safe to say, it's improved by more than 50% in terms of efficiency levels.
Yeah. Um, are they all bifacial, or they are not bifacial? All.
So you sort of have three options. So you can have a monofacial panel where there's only output from the top,
Mm-hmm.
which is probably more suited to your rooftop type projects where you're not getting much light from underneath the panel.
Mm-hmm.
And then nowadays we also have panels which have double glass but are not bifacial.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason for the double glass is that it produces a more reliable panel. So like instead of a 25-year warranty, we can offer a 30-year warranty because often the back sheet, the standard white back sheet that's typical on most panels in the market, that's usually a point of weakness where you can have chemical ingress and other contaminants which lead to longer term degradation. So there's
Okay.
the dual glass which are not bifacial, and then finally there's the dual glass which are bifacial.
Mm.
And then for projects which are ground mounted or fixed or single axis tracking, or and I think Nathan will remember this, about 10 years ago we started looking at solar carports. Remember that, Nathan? So for your solar carports as well, um, there's the opportunity to use bifacial panels, and typically if you're looking at a installation such as a single axis tracker on a utility scale farm, you're looking at least 10% higher output from the same um, basically configuration of panels if you use the bifacial versions. So that 10% extra yield obviously makes a better business case. So I think when you're looking at the utility scale segment these days, 99.9% of the time you're looking at EPCs that are installing single axis trackers with bifacial panels. Also, it's also maybe interesting for us that are, especially for my other Southern African colleagues who are closer to the equator. Um, you know, if you're building a plant, let's say in Kenya, for example, should it be north facing or should it be south facing? When you're that close to the equator, you're gonna basically be losing a lot of energy unless you have a tracking system. So their single axis trackers make a lot of sense, especially combined with bifacial panels.
Maybe just a very quick comment on the size of the modules, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because from an EPC side, we've seen the module sizes increase, the module efficiency themselves increase, but the size also increased. But
Yes.
it is getting to a point where the physical size of the modules is making it harder and harder to install. At the moment, you're looking at 2.5 meter tall panels, right? So how big can they go? They're also getting heavier. And especially if you're looking at, let's say you're doing a tracker system, single axis tracker to import it. Now you've got a 5 meter span, so it's 5 meters of panels that need to tilt this way and that way, which is massive, so there is a physical limitation of that. And I'm speaking under correction, but I don't expect the physical size of the panels to become much bigger than they are now. I think that we're likely to see the increase in performance more than the actual increase in physical dimensional sizes, because it is getting to a point where, if they get any bigger, it will be very hard to actually practically install them, to get on a roof or to get them onto a tracker system.
So
Yes.
just to chime in there, with the single axis trackers, your point is well noted, Gabriel. I mean, with the enlarged size of the modules, the obviously the array or the wing span becomes significantly larger, right? And it's almost like an exponential curve. So you end up having to upgrade all the componentry around it, right, and elevate the height of the system. So what we've seen is a trend moving back to 1Ps as opposed to 2P trackers. So Adimatec, as an example, have a 1P tracker that works out more cost effective than a 2P. The guys from STI Norland have been adamant about a 1P tracker from the outset, right? They haven't changed their tone at all. So it is partially because of the sort of rampant increase in modules. But I think what the guys have also started to do, it's a small moan because I understand you guys are innovating, but the module widths have grown quite a lot. So like I think one of the Canadian modules now is 1303 in terms of its width. So there's obviously there's some physical limitations moving away from the motor that's driving the tracker. So you end up fitting fewer modules on in order to accommodate the limitation, the physical limitation of the system that's been designed and ratified by Black and Veatch and banked and all that sort of jazz. So those two
Yes.
things in combination, just you're right, they add to the complexity of trying to engineer these systems further down the value chain. So you end up shoehorning this module into what you have because the cost of revisiting all of this stuff is pretty high, and you don't know if the module manufacturer is going to change it again.
Yeah, no, I agree with both speakers. Maybe just to focus on the different segments once again. So in Europe, there's a new regulation which basically says for rooftop residential, your panel size can't be more than 2 square meters. I think they've decided on that because of the difficulty of handling and the dangers associated with maybe handling a 2.4 meter by 1.3 meter panel on a average European rooftop. So consequently, our 420, 425 watt panels are designed so that I think the one is like 1.999 square meters of area. And obviously the current is matched for the inverters. So we've got a product targeted for your residential rooftop installers that is manageable for them, physically manageable for them. Of course, on your utility scale plants on the other end of the spectrum, they usually, I mean, you would have 2 people handling it and, assisted by mechanical devices and so on. So it's a bit easier to handle the bigger panels on those. As Nathan mentioned, some of these 210 millimeter cell panels previously were about 1.3 meters wide. But in my presentation earlier on, I mentioned that we've now changed the cell size to the rectangular cells, so it's 210 by 182. So consequently, we have panels that are narrower than they were before because of that change in dimensions. So, you're looking at a more manageable width on your panel. So you can still go 1P, or if you really like 2P. The choice of 1P versus 2P on a single axis tracker depends on multiple factors, particularly the type of terrain that you're trying to cover. If you've got a fairly rectangular, fairly flat field, then looks like the market is moving towards 1P configurations. But if you've got an irregular terrain, possibly hilly, and where the geotechnicals show that the ground is quite difficult to put piles in, then you'd probably want to minimize your piles, and you might be wanting to consider going a 2P configuration. So it's very, I would say it's very site dependent, and you'd have to have a custom solution depending on the specific site that you're looking at. So there's no one size fits all type of approach there. But at the end of the day, I suppose the ultimate goal is to reduce your overall levelized cost of electricity. So you'd have to look at the cost of the tracker, the cost of the modules, the cost of the whole system, and specifically the energy yield you can get from the system. It's not just about capital cost, it's about the amount of energy you can get for that capital cost.
Thank you very much, everybody, for your deep insight, brilliant discussion, and I'm sure the audience loved everything that you said. Over to you, Shakshi.
I
And
think we just have one more question which has just
we
come
have
up.
one more question. Let's have it.
Yes.
Will South Africa PV market become regulated in order to protect end users? Nathan?
Sure, I can chime in a bit. I think we can share the answer around here. There are efforts to do it. There's a SAPVIA, which is a PV body, which looked to introduce some sort of green card regulations, but I think they've pulled it back, and they basically need to relaunch that process and go through some more broader training, because it was very restricted to rooftop and heavily focused on electrical without much consideration for the balance. So I think the again, it sort of refers back to my commentary on the glacial pace of our state. they're far behind in trying to understand this. And this is a conversation we have quite regularly in the office, in terms of regulating the sector so that we've got a consistent playing field that all of us are playing on, so that we can, ensure that the quality of the installations meets sort of minimum thresholds. So I think the state and the sort of South African Bureau of Standards, and with SA in whatever it is, the SANS codes, they haven't caught up. So we still don't have much regulation around, wind loading on structures. We borrow EU norms and codes from our European contemporaries, and we refer to South African codes in terms of a shed design effectively, but it's not solar PV specific. So I think it almost entails an independent regulatory board established by the sector to keep itself in check. My sentiment to PV, as a general comment, particularly within a South African context, is that we may end up killing the sector ourselves purely because of the mistakes that are made and the lack of regulations, etc., etc. And I think that I see as a bigger risk than the actual technology being adopted. So without that independent regulatory board that actually has some teeth to what it can do, I don't really see that the state doing much around this, or certainly not being able to enforce it. So like you have regulatory boards for accountants and for lawyers, etc., bar councils, etc. Something like that, I think, could be a very interesting way to protect end users, and the sector as a whole from capitulation under the mass of its own mistakes.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Thank you very much, Craig, for the question. Always dynamic sector moving forward and need very intelligent people to navigate and move forward. Speaking of moving forward, we move forward to you, Shaksi, and I would like to thank everybody for their contributions today. And I hope, and I'm sure that the audience benefited from this discussion. Thank you, everybody, and over to you, Sakshi.
Thank you so much, Mr. Samir, for superbly managing the session. Big shout out to our attendees for extending their time and support for the event. And a very special thanks to our partner, Trina Solar, for extending their support to organize the event. And we cannot express enough gratitude for all our speakers who are here today. We had a great session, and we promise to be back with many more exciting events soon. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Thank you,
guys.
folks.
you.
Have a good day.